So the intention of this particular tutorial is to put some meat around the bones of the concept of tactics and strategies. Before we get to that though, I kind of want to introduce you to some primary ideas that I think are essential before we kind of get to that point. The first thing is I'd like you to grasp that there is a clear distinction. I'm sure this isn't going to be too challenging for you. There's a clear distinction between what we might loosely refer to as individual and what we might refer to as team-based sport. And of course, that's going to lead to a distinction in the types of tactics and strategies that might be employed. So for example, when we talk about individual sports, we might be talking about things such as gymnastics. We might be talking about things such as combat sports. Now, that's not to say that gymnastics, someone cannot contribute to a team, but of course, in terms of the performance, they're performing alone. Whereas sports such as netball games, think about things like tennis, for example, can be played in doubles format, or we might say striking and fielding games such as rounders, baseball, cricket, for example, are obviously played in teams. So, of course, the tactics and the strategies within these environments are going to differ because there's more than one participant actually involved. And perhaps the best example that so many of you will be involved in, I'm sure, are the idea of invasion games: hockey, netball, football, rugby, basketball, hurling. These sorts of games are going to obviously have very specific tactics and strategies because they involve multiple players within the same performance environment. Now, the other point I kind of wanted to get to is that I'd really like you to have a nice understanding of the concept of technique. And technique, again, is important because when we think about something like a strategy, we'll ultimately think about what strategy or plan do we use to actually apply a particular technique. So let us understand what that technique is. First of all, a technique is a sequence of actions. Okay, so it involves motor tasks, it involves movement by definition. A technique is also sport specific. Okay, so we might notice that running, for example, is not a sport-specific activity, but high hurdling while sprinting is, for example. We also might want to think about technique that it is what we might refer to as position, or event specific. And again, what we're saying here is that it's specific to not only the sport, but to a particular position. Think about the technique and application of strategies and tactics, likewise, of a midfielder compared to a striker, for example, or a centre as opposed to a shooter if you play netball, for example. Those are significant differences. And my last 2 points are that technique follows a technical model. In other words, there's a model of performing that's considered to be correct, the correct performance. It's often when someone performs in that correct way that we might even find it beautiful to the eye. But perhaps even more spectacular than that is that sometimes there will be people who produce completely novel responses. And what we mean by that is that they'll actually break the technical model, that they'll do it differently to what is in the textbook, but they'll produce some magnificent outcomes and performances, even though they're doing it away from this technical model point. So the thing I notice a lot around coaching and training is very, very frequently based specifically at this technical model. And it's understandable, but perhaps that kind of negates the possibility of novel responses being achievable and possible by a whole range of performers. But anyway, that's another more philosophical point. Now, I also want to address the idea of the refinement of technique. The refinement of technique. If we want to increase the technique that somebody applies to a particular sporting situation, whether it be, a sprint start or striking a football or whatever, we're going to go through certain protocols. And here's one that I would like you to be aware of. The coach very frequently is going to observe the performance, is going to observe the technique that's being applied. Then perhaps what they're going to do is they're going to compare that technique. Okay, remember that the comparison is going to come to the technical model that they deem as correct. They're then going to do what we call analyze or an analysis. To analyze something means to break it down into its parts. So once we've compared it to the technical model, we may break down, say, a forehand stroke in tennis. We may break it down into a part such as the grip, say. So we break it down to those parts. And then, of course, what do we do at that point? And this is where we get into our real nitty-gritty of what we're going to talk about today. we then strategize, and that strategy is about improving or refining that technique. So remember, strategy is not just how we set up in our team formation before we go out to the pitch, but it's also the strategy we use to improve the techniques that we're applying. Now, a couple of final points before we really get to the nitty-gritty. I also want to talk about skill development with you. Now, a skill, very important we recognize this, a skill is what we would refer to as a learned action. So it's learned. So if we're going to learn a skill effectively, we have to go through certain processes, which we're going to talk about in this course. So we have to get the classification of skill correct. Do we practice an open skill in an open environment, for example? If the skill is highly organized, we're unlikely to break it down to subroutines. These things matter. Secondly, we have to, based on, as I mentioned already, on the basis of our classification of the performance, we have to get the practice right. And getting the practice right is what we sometimes refer to, a good term for you to use here, as purposeful practice. The practice actually relates to how the skill is classified, but also it's specific and age and skill appropriate for the participant. And the next point we want, and of course this is very important in various learning models, is the idea of repetition. Learning of skill and technique happens through good quality repetition. Now, I've been promising the nitty-gritty for some time, so let's get on with it. I want to address with you the idea of tactics. Okay, the idea of tactics. Now, the first thing I'd like you to realize is that tactics are a plan. Okay, they are a plan. And there's two possibilities that we could have for our plan. The first one is that the plan is to improve something. Remember what I said before, that we talked about the refinement of technique through a structure, through a strategy. And the other reason we would apply a tactic is to win. Now, the point I would make to you is that these concepts are, of course, linked to each other, but they are not necessarily always overlapping. You might want to think about the tactics that are applied in your own sporting context and the coaches that you work with. Are they focused on this primarily to win, or are they focused first on the improvement of performance, which is then going to create a winning or a more likely winning experience? And we've got certain factors affecting this. So we've got certain factors affecting our tactical application. And what are they? Well, first of all, their timing. Which are we? If we've got if we're playing a hockey league and we've got 1 minute left in a match and we need to score to draw to win the league or something like that, the timing of that's important, because we might all of a sudden forget that improving is the objective. It is simply to win or to draw, in that, as the example I just gave. So get the ball up the end and get it in the net is the only thing that matters in that environment. The other thing is about conditions. And with conditions, we are literally talking about the conditions that you face in the sporting context. The wind, the rain, the temperature. Does that affect how you can apply? Because, can you have a very technical performance? In rugby, say, when it's pouring rain and highly windy, maybe you just keep hold of the ball and keep it as simple as possible. Okay, you might not improve technically that way, but you might be more likely to win. It also depends on who the opposition is and the quality of the opposition, the familiarity of the opposition. An opposition who you are confident you are performing at a high level and you may focus simply on improvement, for example. It also depends on history and tradition. Okay, so which of these that we work towards. But what we mean by that is that if the sport is developed in a context where winning is the only thing of value, then of course that's where the focus is going to go. And of course the other thing is age. Now, of course, if you're working with an Olympic 100-meter finalist and you say, look, in this Olympic 100-meter final, probably you'll only ever race it once or twice in your life, but we're going to look to focus on improvement through your technique. No, we're in that situation to try to win. So of course it depends on the stage the performer's at. Finally, in what has become a rather lengthy tutorial, I want to talk to you about strategies. Now, strategies we could almost use synonymously with tactics, but they are slightly different. And this is the point I want to make to you. A strategy is what we call a general approach. A general approach to a competition. A general approach to a competition, including the practice environment. Okay, so strategies are more general than tactics. And what we mean by that is that the overall strategy might not include things like specific set plays, who plays in which position. There might be more general, strategy could be to give 11-year-old basketball players, say, an opportunity to play in a range of different positions. Okay, so that's going to be important as well. But it's a more general approach. And the final point I make is that it might have an implication for us for the types of practice we use. What's our general strategy for the types of practice we use? And how do we encourage the transfer of skills through our strategies? Okay, so lots to think about, a bit longer than I intended to go for. Cheers.